Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Museum of the City of New York. My name is Fran Rosenfeld. I'm the Director of Public Programs, and thanks for braving it tonight to join us for the final program in our Mastering the Metropolis series, which has been developed in collaboration with the Municipal Art Society. Tonight's program is called Comparative Zoning, Looking to Other Cities, and we'll be discussing zoning beyond the 5 boroughs, if you can believe that. There is a world outside of the city, this city. The discussion is going to feature 5 people who are going to be fascinating to hear from, starting with Richard Bass. If you would just raise your, I think they're seated in this order, but just raise your hand anyway. Senior Planning and Development Consultant at Akerman LLP, and the former Planning Director of the Manhattan Borough President's Office, City of Jersey City, and the City of Coral Gables. Then we have Jerold Kayden, the Frank Backus Williams Professor of Urban Planning and Design at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. We have Kairos Shen, City Planner and Urban Designer, and former Director of Planning at the Boston Redevelopment Authority. Harriet Tregoning, City Planner, Public Policy Entrepreneur, and former
Go Harriet. Wow.
and former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Office of Community Planning and Development in the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And last but not least, our moderator for the evening is Marisa Lago, who is Director of the New York City Department of City Planning and the Chair of the New York City Planning Commission. So this is a very illustrious panel. Really appreciate your participation. Following the panel, we'd like to invite all of you upstairs for a wine reception in the rotunda. And we will also invite you to go up to the 3rd floor. You can have a chance to see Mastering the Metropolis, the exhibition, which actually closes on April 23rd. So we're heading into the last few weeks of the exhibition, if you haven't had a chance to see it already or want to visit it again. And I just want to especially thank the Municipal Art Society for co-presenting this series with us. Founded in 1893, MAS advocates for excellence in urban planning, design, historic preservation, and community engagement across the 5 boroughs. And we're thrilled to have had this chance to partner with them. Also would like to thank other supporters for the evening, who include the AIA New York Chapter, Center for Architecture, and the New York City Department and the New York Department of City Planning. And you can find a complete list of those organizations in your program. Finally, please take this moment to silence anything that might buzz or beep, but feel free to tweet during the program using the hashtag zoning100. And you will find an index card on your seat. And so please use that to write down any questions that you want to ask to pose to the speakers during the program. And then we'll have volunteers walking around. They can collect them from you and bring them up to the moderator. And we'll let her ask, as she will, them of the panelists. So now I'd like to warmly welcome Elizabeth Goldstein, the president of the Municipal Art Society, known as a forceful and tenacious advocate for parks, open spaces, and historic preservation. Elizabeth previously served as director of planning for the city's Department of Parks and Recreation, and later as New York City regional director of the State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. And for the past 12 years, she served as president of the California State Parks Foundation, where under her leadership, the foundation dramatically increased its membership and doubled its operating budget. She returns to New York City as the newly appointed president of MAS. Please welcome Elizabeth Goldstein.
Thank you very much, Fran, and thank you to the Museum of the City of New York for serving as our co-presenters and gracious hosts for the series. It's been a huge pleasure to collaborate since we began this series, actually last July, in tribute to the zoning centennial, and we look forward to more partnering and programs to come. I want to take an opportunity to invite you all in this audience to come join us for an upcoming MAS event called Jane's Walks, which is the first weekend in May, the 5th through the 7th. In tribute to Jane Jacobs, the festival includes over 100 free neighborhood walking tours all over the city of New York, covering topics, many of which will be addressed today, and some that have been addressed as part of the series, from neighborhood character and urban resilience to infrastructure and affordable housing. And you'll find a postcard on your seats with some details about that program. And I'd like to turn the floor over tonight to tonight's moderator, Marisa Lago. Marisa was appointed by Mayor de Blasio as the director of New York City Department of Parks and the chair of the City Planning Commission, and began just this past month. So we're very pleased that you're here. This is her third stint in New York City government, having worked previously for mayors Dinkins and Koch. Prior to city planning, she served in the Obama administration in the Department of the Treasury as Assistant Secretary for International Markets and Development. And she's also held extensive other positions in various places, including the New York Empire State Development Corporation, the Boston Redevelopment Authority, and the Economic Development Corporation, among others. We are thrilled to welcome Marisa back to New York and back to her post at DCP, and honored to have you moderating this evening's panel. Please help me in welcoming her and her esteemed panelists to the stage. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. It is such a pleasure to be up here with these luminaries. Richard, who has dedicated, I don't want to out your age, but 40 years to topics of land use and zoning. Jerold, you heard about his role at Harvard, but he is also one of the world's premier land use experts. He has done work for the U.S. Agency for International Development, the World Bank, the UN, so he has not just a national but an international reputation. I have to admit, a very warm spot in my heart for Kairos, because we had the pleasure of working together at the Boston Redevelopment Authority. And anyone who goes to Boston and sees what had been an utterly abandoned old seaport district transformed with a convention center and a mixed-use office, commercial, residential neighborhood sees Kairos's handiwork. And Harriet, while we haven't met before, I owe you such a debt of gratitude. For the last 7 years, I've lived in Washington, D.C. I had lived there before during the Clinton administration, and the difference that you made is night and day. It is such a vibrant, energetic, and as someone who is a bicyclist, a bike-friendly and walk-friendly city. So thank you. So I thought it might be a little bit helpful for folks who are not quite as much zoning geeks as those of us who are up here to put a little bit of context before we kick it off with the panelists. So at New York City, as New Yorkers, we're incredibly proud of our city, and we're proud of the role that we've played in the invention of zoning, as well as our ongoing upkeep, our innovation to make sure that zoning is addressing emerging issues. But as any great innovator must do, we have to listen to others who have lessons from outside of our city, what's going on in other cities. There's a lot that we can learn from other cities, whether it comes to creating affordable housing, cultivating job growth, or building resiliency against climate change. Now, to frame the discussion, let's take a step backwards and look at the New York Zoning Code. The resolution reached its 100th anniversary last year, and to celebrate, the Department of City Planning spent much of the year with events that looked at the zoning resolution from its birth, its infancy, and its evolution, because the city has changed over 100 years, so must the zoning code. So why was the 1916 zoning code so revolutionary? It was the first one in the nation. It defined what could be built. It designated residential neighborhoods and protected them from uses that were incompatible with residential uses. It is also what led to the development of these beautiful, tall, slender office towers that you see in our older business districts. And it also led to a building type so familiar to us in New York, the 6-story residential buildings that still define many of our boroughs. Now, the 1916 zoning resolution was short. It was under 20 pages, And for those of us who work in the field, we have to gasp because today, it's around 1,500 pages long. But even though it was short, it was absolutely revolutionary. It had a profound effect. Other cities throughout the US perked up and started adopting their own. Let's fast forward to mid-century, mid-1900s. By that point, the zoning resolution was getting on 40 years old. It was beginning to show its age. The city in the mid-50s was seen as crowded, as dowdy, as not having enough open space. And following World War II, the region was suburbanizing. We were moving towards the automobile culture. Perhaps the most interesting reason of why the wise folks in the late 50s and early 60s undertook a comprehensive relook at the zoning resolution was that if the city had been built out to what was allowed under the 1916 zoning code, we would have housed a population of 55 million. Clearly, the zoning code was just out of date for the city. The other thing that had occurred is that planning concepts had changed. At that time, there was the Le Corbusier Tower in the Park approach to the building form. So, reflecting on this changed perspective, in '61, the city undertook a soup to nuts reevaluation of its zoning. The zoning code went from being a limitation on what was allowed to happen, and instead it was much more prescriptive in shaping and directing changes in the city. The new zoning code sought to impose a different physical form on the city, and it also added requirements for open spaces and parking. It acknowledged the fact that the city was going to rebuild itself in place rather than continue to expand and grow to a city of 55 million, which would be large even by the standards of cities in China and the developing world. So now let's fast forward from the 1961 zoning resolution. What's happened since then? Well, there was the introduction of contextual zoning in the 80s, the creation and the proliferation of special districts with much more bespoke requirements, the development of urban design and streetscape standards, a recognition of the imperatives of sustainable design and of resiliency, and most recently, in 2016, the adoption of a citywide zoning change that was focused on zoning quality and affordability, with the purpose of promoting affordable housing. Now, outside of New York, there are a wide range of approaches to zoning, which respond to the unique character, but also to the regulatory environment in different cities. Some cities have prescriptive zoning, other cities have more permissive zoning, and a couple of cities have opted to have no zoning at all. The relative virtues of these different approaches are hotly debated among planning and land use types, and so that's why I'm so pleased to be here and kick off this panel. So, if I could start with asking each of you a relatively open-ended question and ask you in 2 minutes to say, what are some of the most prominent land use challenges that you are seeing across different American cities, and how zoning is being used to address these challenges? Harriet, if I could start with you.
You touched on one of the things that I think has been very challenging. For much of the history of our country, a lot of the affordable housing was market rate affordability. It wasn't particularly subsidized. We just had different housing with different value, and we had in most of our communities an economy that would support a range of wages, and most people could find housing that was suitable to the wage that they were earning. In many of our cities, especially where the economy is the hottest, almost all of the market rate affordability is gone. I came out of HUD most recently. I know that the federal government is supporting only one of every 4 households that have an income and a need for affordable housing, so it's created a real crisis. So every city who either has growth or is anticipating it is looking for ways to use tools, including zoning, to try to get more affordable housing. You mentioned the evolution of parking when we didn't have parking standards in most cities until zoning codes that were adopted in the 1950s. As our good friend Don Shoup in California at UCLA would tell you that those standards weren't based on anything in particular. And at this point, we have roughly 7 to 9 parking spaces for each and every automobile in America. And this is an asset that we use on average across the country 5% of the time, park 95% of the time. That's why disruptive technologies like Uber and Lyft and other types of ride sharing have become so popular. That's why a younger generation is saying, there's not a great value proposition for me if I can figure out any other way to get my access and mobility. So cities are really challenged to figure out how to right-size their parking, and even, I think we'll have some conversation about it later, what to do to repurpose the structures that have been used for parking.
Thank you. Kairos.
So I'm going to deviate from your question because I don't think coming
Like
from
any
Boston,
good panelist would.
coming from Boston, land use is probably secondary to the negotiation that occurs in our system. So we've long abandoned, I think, as of right zoning. So zoning in Boston is for reference only. So you look at it, you understand some of the context that it was developed under, but know that the city's looking for different things and the community is looking for different things.
And if I could just interject here, interestingly, the contrast with New York City, where over 90% of building occurs without having to go anywhere near a discretionary approval.
Right. So it's the exact reverse. So maybe 5% of our development is done as of right. So the issue here is that because we've been doing it for so long, the problem is that the public has been actually transferring a lot of the responsibilities of city building to the private sector. And the question is, have we reached a limit to the point where we cannot extract any more? And we're trying to figure out, actually right now, the current mayor, Mayor Walsh, is going through a citywide plan for the first time since 1965. And the goal at the end of it is to adopt a brand new zoning code that will get rid of the case-by-case negotiation and go to a more as-of-right system. So I think that there's reasons to do that, but it would be such a change. It's almost like asking people who've been driving on the left all their life to drive on the right. So it's an experiment that we will see how it develops.
Thank you. We've had two very different approaches to answering the question. Jerold, what direction are you going to take us in?
I think the big issue, really worldwide, certainly in the United States, is the ongoing battle between neighborhood interests and citywide interests. And that plays out particularly with regard to zoning changes. And especially when it's married to the desire to monetize air rights. I've said many times, zoning is for sale, let's just accept that, but then let's figure out how to do it well from the public point of view. When you monetize air rights, you create the incentive for developers to build bigger. And those bigger buildings go in neighborhoods, and they're to achieve through this extra density, not only affordable housing, but infrastructure. We see this right now in New York, of course, with the Greater East Midtown proposal. And it's also battling, development rights above landmarks. So everybody is fighting over air rights, but more air rights, more development, and yet you have neighborhoods who don't want to have more development, wherever that might be. That is something that exists in New York, but you'll be very pleased to know it exists everywhere across the United States in growing cities. Now, of course, we can talk about legacy or right-sizing cities that would love to have, many would say, that kind of concern or problem, but certainly in growing cities.
It is a high-class problem to have, but a challenge nonetheless.
Yes.
Okay, Richard, you have the unenviable task of being the fourth one to answer the question.
Well, I'm going to speak, and I'm on. I'm going to speak from two sides, one as a former planning director and now as a practitioner seeking zoning and discretionary relief. When I was in Jersey City, most of the redevelopment plans, and if you look at a Jersey City map, 3/4 of the city is a special district or a redevelopment plan that was put in place by the developer. Lefrak's project, Newport, the project manager joked that he took his plan and gave it to my predecessor, who signed and sealed it and submitted it for a public review. So my mayor ran on a progressive agenda. So I tried to steer the development community to do affordable housing. We did a linkage program not only for residential use, but for commercial use, because we looked at secondary displacement. We did historic preservation and made zoning ordinances that matched the historic district, so you didn't have that conflict. As a reward, the local newspaper gave me a one-way ticket to Moscow, so you can understand how politically correct it was doing this type of progressive thing. Now I'm a practitioner. I'm now appealing before planning boards, but at the same time, I'm trying to do a development that makes money for my client, because you don't build unless you make money, but there's also community benefits in terms of affordable housing, urban design, a better pedestrian experience, parking. We try to bring common sense to the marketplace. I have a good client base who listen to us, that we can advise them to do the right thing. And the clients that don't listen to us, we fire. So it's an interesting, position that I get to play, where we use the market forces to do the right thing, whether it's on the public sector side or the private sector side.
Thank you. A number of you here have been involved in reforming zoning. And Harriet, you had mentioned some of the changes that we're seeing, autonomous vehicles. We're also seeing the advent of different construction materials that change the built form. We're seeing changes in how people work, the changing nature of retail. How do these changes factor into how you think about rezoning? Does it call for more frequent rezoning? And how do you think about having a zoning code that can be adapted quickly as society changes quickly?
I know this is a panel about zoning, but I would really emphasize that zoning is only one of many tools. One of the greatest things about being a planner or planning director in particular is that you have the bully pulpit all the time, every day, and that no one is as much looking at the future as you are. So you get to tell people the story of what is happening, what is the tide of change that people are swimming in right now and might not even be aware of it. So it's almost a magical thing. It used to make me think that I could, if I repeated something 3 times in public, by the 3rd time someone would have formed a company or a nonprofit or done something to fix the problem that I described. I mean, I'm sure that was an exaggeration. It seemed like that sometimes. So I would just say zoning is only one of those things. But, so the question of, we could pick any one of those things. Let's talk about retail and how retail is changing. And, this might be the worst year we've ever had in terms of retail bankruptcies. It's not just how we're shopping that's different. It's that we were over-retailed, perhaps to begin with. And a lot of our zoning codes mandate retail. Right? We thought that's the way we enliven streets. That's the way we create safety. That's the way we have people coming and going. But there are lots of ways for that to happen. My favorite street enlivening use is a doggy daycare, where they have big glass windows and big playrooms where the little dogs all play together and the medium dogs all play together and the large dogs all play together. And there's a crowd. It's like Macy's Christmas windows, like outside every single time I go by. I take a different route just to walk by that window, right?
What's interesting about that is growing up in Brooklyn Union Gas, every Easter time would hatch the little eggs. And here was a dull bank building, and yet the animals brought it to light. So it's something old coming around again.
That would have been a use that could never have been in a retail space because it didn't generate enough dollars per square foot, although maybe the way we pay for things for dogs, maybe that is now something that's true. But it's also something that we need to think differently about how we use that code. And one of the things that I helped to get started in DC, we had mostly office developers who didn't know anything about retail. All they wanted was something called a national credit tenant, a bank or a drugstore, right? Most of them had really dead spaces along those street fronts, and so it was terrible to get one of those clients. And they might leave a first floor vacant for 4 years, for 5 years, for 6 years, waiting for that national credit tenant. Meanwhile, the tenants that they were trying to get their real business fill the building with had no amenities. So we started doing pop-ups, and that wasn't a zoning change. That was something that we worked on with our building permit people.
Brilliant. Jerold, any further thoughts on this?
Well, one of the questions that comes out of your question is not just, responding to small changes, but what about responding to the big change of should a city consider redoing its entire zoning resolution? Certainly this 100th year in New York has led to a lot of people to ask the question, does New York City need a new zoning resolution? And it's interesting to look around the country. Certainly over the past 10, 15 years, there have been a lot of major cities in the United States and even around the world that have actually decided, forget the small thing, we're going to do the big thing. And I've looked at a lot of them, and it seems to me that there are 5 basic reasons as to why cities, certainly around the United States, consider redoing their entire zoning resolution. And one might think of that in terms of where New York stands right now. And then the 6th reason is, a new chair comes in. So it's, all right, now I just made that up. All right.
What's interesting, Jerold, on this is that the scale of the city, if one looks at the 2016 zoning for quality and affordability to spur affordable housing and improve housing quality overall, that was citywide. That was massive. If you look at just one of the rezonings that we're actively engaged in now, a 2-mile strip under the elevated 4 train along Jerome Avenue, the population within the area that is being looked at is half the size of the city of Boston. Yes. And so I wonder if you think about it as an either or as a spectrum.
I don't think of it as an either or. And by the way, small zoning changes can be equally complicated. But there is something different about saying, do we really need to change this entire vehicle? As I said, there are 5 reasons. One reason was the New York reason in 1961 changed conditions on the ground. And Marisa, you already addressed that. New types of buildings, tenants, styles, et cetera. Another reason that's very typical is antiquated zoning. Language is out of date, or obsolete procedures, or inconsistencies. I love this. This could be New York. This is from Los Angeles, which is doing its Recode LA over 5 years, doing a totally new zoning resolution. Quote, first adopted in 1946, the current code has grown from a simple 84-page pamphlet to an unwieldy 600-page book that inadequately realizes the 21st century vision of a better Los Angeles for all residents. And that's what you said at the beginning. That's what people say about New York's, it's gone absolutely crazy. Philadelphia redid its entire zoning resolution in 2007. It was a 4-year process, and they list the 50 public hearings that they had, the 2 city council public hearings, the 36 community boards, the thousands of people who were interviewed, et cetera. Detroit has its pink zoning initiative, which is an antidote to red tape. Again, all because of obsolete kinds of things, definitions that were definitions useful in the 40s, but that make no sense today. Atlanta is doing a zoning ordinance diagnostic to test out bad language. The other reasons, the 3rd reason, new technologies now allow for much more user-friendly. LA is really going user-friendly with technology, its Recode, a dynamic web-based zoning code. 4th reason, new zoning approaches. So form-based zoning has swept the country, Miami, Denver, Atlanta, Milwaukee. I mean, this is the sort of hot thing. And then finally, a planning or visioning exercise. Zoning is just one tool, as Harriet said. And Miami in particular, but there are many cities, Miami 21, your city, your plan. I mean, that's the language, right, that we can use anywhere. And a new zoning code was part of it. But saying, let's just do everything, and zoning is going to be the end product in Boston as well, but it's part of a big planning
Can we bring
exercise.
Kairos into this conversation?
When I listen to what you just said, Jerold, the first thing that comes to mind is that how has the real estate industry evolved in the time period that zoning code, the various sort of generations of zoning code, and I think it seems to me that the reason why it got to be so complicated was because the sophistication of the industry that is implementing zoning or using zoning to build. I mean, today's real estate as an instrument of investment, is completely different than the reasons why people built when zoning was first adopted, let alone 10 years ago. So, I've increasingly seen this as planners are smart, but not as smart as real estate developers. And I think the part of the reason why these codes in all these cities have gotten so complicated is because it's like the mouse actually well, the cat chasing the mouse, but the mouse is just much more agile. So it relates to your earlier question about agility. And I'm going to say that I think the important thing is not to try to figure out all the rules that you need in order to bracket the inventiveness of the real estate industry. But you need something much more simple that define the kind of relationship that you want to have with the real estate industry in order to both benefit. So now that's hard. And I don't know that you could have, I don't know how many pages it would be, but at least it wouldn't be reactive to something that was a way to sort of bypass or be really intelligent in interpreting the current rules to make the real estate project more feasible, more profitable. I keep thinking that if the public could figure out how to do that the same way as the private sector can, then we would have a good code.
But there's unequal access to information, unequal financial incentives. I see Richard wanting to weigh in, and Harriet says she's going to mix it up by disagreeing with you after that.
I like your last point. I will speak to policy. How many have been to Coral Gables, Florida? I see a hand. Coral Gables has a really beautiful architectural type, but the zoning code has been doctored so many times you can't build a Coral Gables building in Coral Gables. And when I was there, I tried to step back and say, what is the policy we're trying to accomplish? And then write a code based on that policy. Because over the next 30, 40 years, with a demolition here and a demolition there, and they build to the zoning, you get the Kendall approach, the mansionization. And Coral Gables will wake up one day and realize their pocket was picked.
Harriet?
I love the development community. I give them a lot of credit. They put up with a lot from us as the public sector. But I will say that I don't find them so very smart, so very adaptable. I never ever had a single developer who came to me in a meeting for a discretionary approval who had any idea what the publicly available census data said about the household rate of car ownership. So they had some idea about parking that had nothing to do with the pattern of automobility and car ownership in the neighborhood they were building in. And I just thought that was so ridiculous. It's publicly available. I was like, is your project going to change the whole neighborhood? It is not. So that's one example, but think about developers are lemmings in some ways. They follow a building type. They begin paying for a project years before it gets delivered, and that's why it's such a boom and bust cycle. They all crowd into the same idea, and by the time that trend has passed, things are overbuilt, a whole bunch of people go bankrupt. It's not a pretty sight. And what we used to do so well with our building types, do you know that Stuart Brand book, How Buildings Learn? There's so many examples of buildings that have had 50 lives. They've been all kinds of things. The first house I bought in Washington, D.C., it was a boarding house when I bought it. I made it a single-family house, and now it's a 2-unit house, right? But it can adapt, and many forms can adapt so easily, but these large floor plate, built for law firm office buildings are really having a hard time now that the workplace has changed.
In buildings learning, or the way we view buildings evolving, it is ironically appropriate that the headquarters of the Department of City Planning are in the Equitable Life building. It is the building at 120 Broadway that, when it was built, was so massive and cast such huge shadows over its neighbors that it led to the creation of the 1916 zoning code. So it was despised at the time, and today it's a revered landmark. It's viewed as a beautiful building. The same could be said for the Eiffel Tower, which was viewed as an abomination. Can I take this in a slightly different direction? Jerold, I was struck by your talking about the balance between a local perspective and a citywide perspective. That is very germane in New York, because the pattern has emerged that the city councilor in whose district a project is has almost up or down, yes or no say over it. And I thought I might turn it over to you, Richard, because you've seen public engagement processes in very different settings, and wondered if you saw best practices for engaging local stakeholders, but still allowing a city to address citywide needs.
Well, I'll give you a couple bad examples. New Jersey and Florida both require master plans. When I became the planning director for Gables, the consultant was in the process of creating the revised master plan. They interviewed 36 people, and that satisfied the community outreach for the vision. Right, your mouth opened up. I was like, it was too far along. I wasn't going to insert myself, but that's not a community process. Jersey City, state of New Jersey, your zoning code is based on your master plan. So there's a 6-year review. But again, it's just a paper process. New York City, when we did the charter revision, had the 197A plan. And communities were excited by this, that they would get to plan despite city planning. But over the last 15 years, they found it's pretty an empty vessel in that it's a frustrating, here's a vision for my community, but then we still have to go through a rezoning process that's really controlled by city planning or by the development community. So it's a yin-yang, right? Before I came here tonight, I was in a meeting in Williamsburg. I'm trying to do a rezoning in Bushwick, and Bushwick is going through a community-based planning process. Well, my project is retail, manufacturing, market rate, and affordable housing. It should be their poster child of what they want, but it could take them a couple years to get to where I'm at today. And my clients won't be standing when the process is done. One guy has an offer from McDonald's, and another guy has an offer for long-term storage, and they may do that and park it for 20 years.
Now, Kairos, you spoke about how in Boston there is no such thing as of right, which means that the community gets a voice in everything. How does Boston accommodate siting of public facilities that neighborhoods might not want, adapting to a growing city that needs additional growth while still having the community so very and appropriately empowered?
Well, it's like brain surgery, right? Well, if you're awake, it's painful. So I think the problem here is that in the years that I worked in Boston, the communities represented themselves very, very well because they know how to advocate for themselves. And the only people in the room that was advocating for a broader perspective were the professionals. And that actually caused a lot of skepticism about whether the professionals actually, in fact, A, understood the neighborhood's needs, and B, that they had some other agenda that was not related to the neighborhood. And part of it is that, I think planners for a long time didn't know how to actually speak in terms that could be understood by normal people. I always say now that planning and the good that planning brings, citywide kind of sharing of responsibilities and burdens of a growing city, is not self-evident, right? The good that many of us who been in planning for so long is not shared. And so I think so the question is, and I see resiliency and climate change and these kinds of things as an opportunity of bringing more broader perspectives within the neighborhood discussion, because these are not isolated issues, and that it brings non-planners, scientists in some cases in climate change, and people who are in different fields to engage in a larger dialogue. So it's a tough problem. I agree with Jerold. It's not isolated to the big cities. I think that there's always this question about where the authority comes from for these larger issues. So I don't know how to solve it.
Harriet, there's an interesting question from the audience on this topic, which is here in New York we have very powerful community boards that are an invaluable part of the process, but the community boards, while diverse, don't necessarily represent the entirety of the community. And how have you seen any good examples of bringing in those who typically don't have much of a voice? How does one get working parents who might not have the time to go to a community board meeting? And so how do we broaden the net to make sure that the multiplicity of community voices are heard?
So this is maybe an opportunity for me to say how much I really value some sort of citywide planning process. It may not be a comprehensive plan. It might be something more like a resiliency plan or a Plan YC, right? That the opportunity to get people to sit around and think about where they've been and where they're going as a city, what problems are going to face the city, and get some kind of citywide consensus on the direction we're heading in. Because in any given community board, for any given development proposal, it's very easy to say no. It's very easy to say, not my neighborhood. No, there are lots of reasons, all very valid reasons why this isn't a good project. But the folks that are saying no have no responsibility to help to solve the larger problem that we're trying to solve in our city. So if you have these other plans, comp plans, vision plans, a statement of the values of the community, you can say, well, this project is trying to do these three things. So this may not be the only way to do these three things, okay? Tell me, how do you think in your neighborhood you could help us do these three things? Let's have a conversation about it. But if you don't have that base of shared values, it's just really an argument about any given policy or any given development project, which is not that helpful and not that constructive.
And can devolve to a zero-sum game.
It completely can, and for me, I am not interested in planning as a land use exercise. Like every community has both things they don't like about their neighborhood, things they'd like to change, but also and aspirations that they have for it, but they also have things they love and they want to protect. So you need to know these things before you go with a development proposal, and that's the kind of dialogue I think is much more engaging to people. It's not necessarily about professional planning. It's about the future for you, your family, your children, the people are going to come after you in this place.
Can I just,
Okay, lots of interest in this topic, but Jerold
Well,
and then
I think,
Kairos, and then
I'm
we'll
always
move on.
interested, in again, in examples that we can potentially learn from. And there's a very interesting experiment right now occurring in the city of Seattle, where last summer the mayor and the Department of Neighborhoods, which they have in Seattle, announced that the city would cut its relationship as well as funding for the 13 volunteer neighborhood district councils, which are a formal part of planning, or were a formal part of planning in Seattle. By the way, I'm not recommending this, and I don't want community board people to come up to me, after I say all this. This is just the experience from the city of Seattle, but it's very, very instructive. The mayor, here's a quote from him. "Our city has changed dramatically since our district council system was created 3 decades ago, and we have seen them over time become less and less representative, not only of their neighborhoods, but of Seattle itself. They did an audit in Seattle in 2009 of district councils. Here's the report. Quote, "The system is dominated by the presence of longtime members whose point of view is overly dominant at both the district council and city neighborhood council levels, and potentially not representative of the communities they nominally represent." And finally, a city council member in Seattle. Quote, "If you've ever gone to some of these community meetings, they're just deadly dull, and the same 25 people have been there for 100 years. All right, now,
Okay.
So here's their solution. Not only did they actually cut funding and the relationship, but they announced a new Community Involvement Commission with 16 members citywide. So it's not just a visioning exercise, which is temporary. They're trying to institutionalize a body of the public that will be citywide and regularly meet.
Interesting.
I just wanted to bring an experience that both New York City and Boston just went through in the last decade. We both, you actually put a bid together for the Olympic Games. Boston attempted to put a bid, and I think the reason I bring this up is just that I think of the Olympic Games as more tangible as a kind of planning exercise than the kind of planning exercise that planners often engage in at a citywide level. Both because the benefits is more tangible and real. You see it on TV every 4 years, and you begin to imagine what it would take for a city to do that and whether it's good for the city, whatever that means. And I think that if we can make comprehensive citywide plans as tangible as bidding for the Olympics, maybe we would have a better way of getting more people to participate.
What's interesting about that, Kairos, ties into another one of the questions here, because when a city puts together a bid or tries to, it's not just the city, it's the region, right? Because even a city as large as New York couldn't accommodate all of the facilities within the city, and so had to cooperate with surrounding states, surrounding municipalities.
Just to let you know that we barely talked to Cambridge the whole time that we bid for the
Well,
Olympics.
that then leads to my question. My predecessor, Carl Weisbrod, set up in the Department of City Planning a division of regional planning, recognizing that while years ago we might have thought about all those office buildings going up in the evil empire on the other side of the Hudson was bad for the city, that in fact the dynamism in our surrounding regions is essential to New York, that people who live and work in Jersey City come to New York for our cultural offerings, for our restaurants. Getting this division of regional planning, we quickly bumped up against the reality that many of our surrounding suburbs have very small planning departments and don't have the capacity to be able to interact particularly effectively, and that we needed to interact better. Richard, you've operated in cities of different scales. Have you seen good examples of large cities interacting with smaller, large cities learning from smaller cities' planning experiences?
Well, the large cities overwhelm the smaller cities. And in New Jersey, there's 460 municipalities. They all have their own planning function. And it was primarily, the zoning code was written by one guy out of Trenton. But again, I'm going to go back to a Coral Gables example. South of Miami built a mall that had a blank wall 4 blocks long facing Coral Gables CBD. And when I asked my city manager, why didn't you get involved in that public review? He said, it's in South Miami. So I then started a edge analysis looking at how Coral Gables met South Miami, Dade County, West Miami, Miami. Our high-rise district was allowing 16 and 25-story buildings across the street from single-family homes in Miami. Coral Gables wouldn't allow that in our city, but we could do it to your city. So it created a dialogue between the municipalities, so we looked at zoning and land use so we could then avoid those type of mistakes.
Now, Harriet, you've operated in perhaps the biggest mashup of different jurisdictions, because you have not just Washington, D.C., Virginia, and Maryland, but also a federal overlay. How have you navigated that?
It can be a mess, but I would say that in some ways the regional collaboration is like any other kind of collaboration, that if you try to do it with everybody, that almost seems like it can't work. And in every region, there are kind of leaders and laggards. There are like-minded folks. So we're the 3rd largest jurisdiction in our region. 2 of our counties are larger than we are. And, after many decades of decline in the district, we couldn't have gotten anyone to a table that we were sitting at for love nor money. But when we started to grow, when we started to be financially successful, when we weathered the 2008 Great Recession, incredibly well, in part because we had transportation choices that made a huge difference in terms of how households could fare. We had tons of people give up automobiles, 2-car households becoming 1-car households, 1-car households becoming no-car households, almost no bankruptcy or foreclosure within our city limits, and then a rapid recovery, gaining on the region's share of jobs and population. Then people wanted to talk to us, like, what did we do? How did we do it? And we started with some easy things. Our bike sharing network, we have a Capital Bike Share. We're very proud of it. It's our 2nd system. Our first one was an abysmal failure. And it didn't go anywhere. It wasn't regional. Everyone was starting to do their own system. It would have been a mess, but in our 2nd try, we did it as a regional system. And so we had things that we could cooperate around where we had interests in common, and that cooperation has just grown and grown and grown. And the places that were laggards, that were not interested initially, now are interested. So I think that's an easier way, and it also gives you a result much more quickly, because we all live within a political framework, and that a lot of people don't want to make an investment without a short-term payoff. This both sets the table for long-term cooperation, but also gives you some short-term results.
We've got in a number of questions from the audience that are on a much more specific topic. We've been speaking sort of at very abstract general levels, but a number of the questions that have come in have had to do with affordable housing. And I hearken back to your words, Harriet, that zoning is just one part of the toolkit in addressing the affordable housing. But I wondered, Kairos, if you could give us any experiences that you've seen and how zoning can help assure that we have a diverse array at different income points of housing to meet the needs of our cities.
Well, I don't know that Boston is a very shining star in this. I would say that we've had inclusionary zoning as since 2000, and it's still not part of our zoning code, right? It's by executive order. And it is actually something that the new plan would incorporate within the new zoning code when it gets written. And of course, it's now in just about a year ago, it was ratcheted up from 13% on site to now 15 and 18%, depending on which location in the city. And then the cashing out option, which was the preferred option for all the developers, have been increased to be more closer to what a real cost would be to build it if somebody, community developers or others, nonprofits were to build it. So this is a pressing problem. I think I agree with Harriet's assessment that it's zoning and inclusionary zoning is only one of the tools, but increasingly it is the only tool when it comes to resources that the city has. And I think part of the problem is that I think that like many other things, this burden of housing and equitable, affordable housing has to have many participants, and I think the public has to have a strong role. So this is a pressing problem that in Boston is getting worse and worse. And the other big issue, of course, is, if you were to believe Ed Glazer, it's a supply problem. And we just talked, Jerold just talked about how the supply problem cannot be solved just by sort of increasing the zoning potential for districts, because you have the local communities where many of these, where the additional density could go, are not hoping for it or expecting it. So it's a difficult problem.
Harriet?
So I think there are actually a few more tools for zoning, and I don't think most places are thinking about a wholesale upzoning of an entire district, but really looking at corridors, matching it up with infrastructure, especially transportation investment, about where there are jobs. So there's kind of a better rationale, but I will say, if you were to look at a map of my city, you would say, wow, look at where all the poor people live. There's really an immense amount of segregation by race and income, and that is zoning. That is zoning. The whole western part of the city, the largest zone in most cities is a single family zone. And by saying you can't have anything but that, you're also saying, oh, you're going to need quite a bit of money to be able to live over here where the best schools are and where it's the safest. So one of the things that we did with our zoning update was allow accessory units in every single zone. And that's not going to solve our affordable housing problem, but it solves a couple of things. It brings some income diversity to neighborhoods where only there's very high-priced housing. We also have a demographic issue. Our household size is 50% of what it was in 1950. So we have a lot of people, including my mother-in-law, rattling around by herself in a house that once had 9 people in it. So she can't afford to keep it up, you know, and she wants to age in place, but without somebody living nearby, we live a mile and a half away, so we do what we can, but a lot of people don't have family that close. And, you know, having somebody live in that accessory unit both is a source of income, but also a source of some services and some help. So I will say that, you know, this is a problem that requires a citywide look. You know, we have a height limit, and it wasn't until a congressman asked the district for the first time in 100 years if that was working for us, and we got a chance to answer, that we actually did that build-out analysis that many cities routinely do. And we found that, oh my God, we won't have enough zoned land to meet even the middle range population growths if we don't do something. And so height changes, you know, in the federal part of the city could have been part of that solution, but we weren't able to get enough support in the community to do that. But we can still make those changes, but it does mean there's an upzoning, and you wouldn't even be able to have that dialogue if you didn't have that build-out analysis to say, look, you know, all the poor people, all the people who work in service jobs, all the people who've lived here, you know, for 3 generations, they're gonna go if we can't fix this problem. And we have to, and every neighborhood has to be part of the solution. It can't be left to somebody else to fix it.
Jerold, any examples from elsewhere?
Well, by the way, we're not really talking about a zoning problem. I mean, zoning is simply a tool implementing what people want and don't want. So, but there are other zoning tools. I think Kairos was a little bit overly modest about one thing that Boston was an early pioneer in, along with Sacramento, California, and Hartford, Connecticut, which is linkage. It's always struck me as very, very odd. And, you know, I don't mind sort of throwing, you know, things into New York and let people wonder. Why doesn't New York City have a linkage ordinance? Linkage is, you know, office buildings being required to office developers to either build or actually to pay money into a housing trust fund. I mean, New York City celebrates its mandatory affordable, the biggest, the best program bigly, you know, across the, that's what one hears out of New York with inclusionary zoning. But how about linkage? Why not on commercial? By the way, I'm not recommending this, but there are lots of other cities that do this. Or one can think about, again, valorizing. I mean, if you look at São Paulo, which took this very aggressive stance of downzoning the entire city to 1 FAR and then let everybody build back up for housing, you know, and for other kinds of things. So there are lots of innovative kinds of things implemented through zoning that could be done. And finally, I think actually allowing zoning to accommodate all of the different housing types. Kairos, you were addressing this, certainly accessory units, but one could be much more prescriptive in terms of what builders must build. Believe me, REBNY will hate all of this, and that's okay, and then one battles back and forth, and it has to pencil out finally. But one could prescribe the types of units that would accommodate that middle income range, which isn't hit by the 40%, 60%, 80% of area median income.
And what's interesting, in a comment that just came up from the audience, there was the New York variation of your accessory dwelling unit, which are the micro units.
Yeah.
A reconsidering of how people live, what is so magical about the 400 square feet. And with different working and living styles, can we consider smaller units? We have long had in our cities a focus on sustainability, but certainly in New York after Superstorm Sandy, the imperative of resiliency has come to the front of mind. And as I look at the 3 cities that are principally represented here, and I'll toss in Jersey City as well, they all are cities that are at risk. They're cities that have waterfronts. In New York City, we have 520 miles of waterfront. And I wondered if there are good examples, if I could start with you, Richard, with your experience in Jersey City, of how you're effectively folding resiliency into the planning equation.
They didn't at all.
The honest answer.
I'm sorry to say, under Sandy, the northern part of Jersey City and Hoboken was underwater. The sewer system is still wooden. But both communities are building more housing and more commercial development without improving the infrastructure. So it's just waiting for the next storm. So Sorry, I don't have a good example.
Kairos, anything more optimistic in Boston?
So two things. One is that Boston adopted one of the first green building zoning ordinances that require buildings bigger than 50,000 square feet to become certifiable, right? And one of the key components to that is that instead of defining what sustainable is within the code, it basically deferred to USGBC. And it was very uncomfortable for a lot of attorneys because they said, well, you can't rely on
Could you let
another
the audience
organization.
know what the-
USGBC is the US Green Building Council, which is
LEED.
they're
LEED
responsible for
certification.
dealing with, providing the standards for leadership in environmental and I can't remember
So say
energy
LEED,
design.
much
LEED.
easier.
So that was an important component, and the way the code was written was that whatever changes and adaptations that were being done and made by USGBC, our code would simply acknowledge and not even reference, just simply it's outside of the code. The second thing, more recently, was a climate adaptation checklist. So we didn't adopt any regulations per se. We started with baby steps, which is to say, look, we all know it's kind of out there. And instead of telling you what to do to be prescriptive, we simply said, well, tell us what you know about what you're doing for developers. So it starts off in saying, do you know about climate change? As the first question. Second is that if you do know about climate change, where do you know it from?
Right, can you still ask that question?
No, you'll be surprised. You'll be surprised, actually. And then the second was, from what source and authority do you know about climate change? And then the third thing is that, do you have anybody on your team that's helping you answer some of the questions? Now, it then goes on to be more specific about, can your building operate, or have you thought about energy systems that if you were flooded, what would happen? So it's baby steps, but I think what will end up happening is that we have to put some basic performances around that, the same way that in other criteria we have performance standards or minimum standards. I think, and that is where probably some of the problem lies, With things like climate change, it isn't about minimum standards because it's always getting worse, right? And so you need to be more prospective. And again, this is a challenge that I think is fundamental within sort of regulation, which is how do you keep up with something that's changing? Now, will there be another, let's say an authority like the USGBC when it comes to resiliency that the code can then refer to? I think these are the kinds of things that I think regulators and city planners have to be open-minded about.
Now, Harriet, you oversaw planning for a city that has giant flood barriers to protect Georgetown against the Potomac.
When they remember to close them, which doesn't always happen. I would say that, this is an interesting question. We had the same, Boston and DC adopted that green building code, I think within a month of each other. I think you might have been second. But we had a really great experience with our development community. The way we implemented it was we said the government would go first and that we would lead by example and make the market because there was a differential based on other people's experience. It was more costly initially and then it got lower. So we said we'd be the market maker. We passed the law in 2006. You didn't have to comply fully as a private sector developer if it was totally a private project until 2012. We had 9 green buildings in 2006. By 2012, we had 700 green buildings. They didn't wait 1 second. Once they knew it was coming, they all rushed to do it, and they had to be LEED certified. They delivered mostly gold and platinum. Right. I mean, it was crazy. And so now they're like poo-pooing LEED. They're like, LEED, who cares about that? We're generating our own energy. We're doing living water systems. We're doing all this other stuff. So they're a pretty sophisticated group of people. But that being said, we are surrounded by water. We're absolutely surrounded by water.
Basin.
So I think what we're trying to do in the district is really think about adapting to a changing climate. Some of that is with infrastructure. It's not with zoning. It's how are we going to be, and some of it we did memorialize in our zoning code. We borrowed from Seattle with something called a green area ratio for new development and substantial redevelopment on a lot of sites. We also did it in regulation. So we have stormwater fees based on impervious surface and all of that stuff. A lot of places are adopting that who have CSO issues, combined sewer overflows, and are under orders from their regulatory authority, whether in our case it's the US government, for many cases it's the state. But we are also thinking about how do we think about adaptive reuse. So there's a plan that's out there now. You guys have heard of the mall, that green space in Washington, D.C.? We've just redone a lot of the panels there in order to keep the grass green. What if we put parking under the mall like so many European cities do? They have parking in the center. That is the most flood-prone part of the city. That parking, when it's not being used for parking or when we're having a flood, could be substantial flood storage. When we had a very heavy rain in 2006, it was the archives that flooded. It was Smithsonian museums. I mean, that's not a good thing to flood. So think about having those kinds of uses, things that could adapt. We could pay for it with parking revenue just from tour buses alone, and then we'd have this facility that could really be used for storage. So I think that, and by the way, the monuments are going to be beautiful by gondola. Really lovely.
Jerold, as we've been talking about housing, about resiliency, this is pushing the boundaries. This is innovation in zoning. Given your vast experience, including outside the U.S., what are areas where you're seeing innovative pushes? Because I do think it important for us in the U.S. to learn from the emerging world, where frequently of necessity or because they don't have entrenched interests who are vested, let's say, in having landlines. We saw the emerging world adopt cell phone technology so much more quickly. Have you seen in the area of planning, of land use, of zoning, innovative areas where we can look to the emerging world?
Well, they're innovative, but I'm not sure we can look to them because they come out of such very different cultures. Of course, that's true even in the United States. I mean, you look at Dallas and San Francisco, and one is you get your building permit in 30 seconds. By the way, that's Dallas. And, in San Francisco, you're still working on it after several years, quite seriously. So, private property is simply viewed quite differently in other parts of the world, and that allows for very, very dramatic types of policies. So I mentioned in Sao Paulo this whole idea that you could rezone a city down to 1 FAR and then force owners to buy back development rights, and it create certificates that get sold in the market. That's a radical kind of thing. We play in New York with a 15 FAR and going up to the high 20s in Greater East Midtown. Hello, Edith, over there. Nice to see you. So Edith Suchen, director of the Manhattan office. So, that can happen. But that very notion that one could do that. In Paris, there's this fantastically interesting affordable housing program, not really in zoning, but it's a right of first refusal that the city has with regard to a whole series, almost 300 private apartment buildings. If an owner of one of those apartment buildings wants to sell a unit in that building, the city of Paris has a right of first refusal to buy it before anybody else in the market buys it. Now, it's bought at a market price, by the way, determined by the city. And then there can be an appeal to a judge. But these sorts of ideas are really, almost like, can you really do that? And that's the value ultimately of looking at other cities, just the comparison. It doesn't mean you can transfer it and plant it here, but think about it in your individual context.
Richard.
I started my career planning in Israel. When Israel absorbed 1.8 million people between 1948 and 1951, they built very small housing units. Well, the second and third generation, if they were successful, they wanted bigger spaces. There was no product for them in that neighborhood or in that city, so they left, and they were replaced by the next generation of immigrants. Israel now has a program that's allowing those buildings to expand by 20 or 30% so you can grow in place, and so your society grows and stays in place, and you don't have that type of society disruption because you don't have the housing stock.
And that actually is very much related to Harriet's comment about aging in place. Kairos, you in Boston developed an innovation district. I'd be interested in hearing about the district, but also how do you measure success and is it scalable?
Well, it's the innovation district that we started off in is now already moving. And I think a lot of we were lucky after the 2008 financial crisis that it recalibrated a lot of the value of real estate. And that coincided with the fact that the entrepreneurs and the startup industry was still vibrant. And next to MIT in Kendall Square, not on the other side of the river, there was not enough supply. So I think what we were able to do there was to take advantage of a few mega, 20-some acre development approvals that were up, and we tailored some zoning and some requirements that help sort of promote the innovation economy, we call it. And part of it is the ability for us through the negotiation with the individual developer to basically write into their tailor-made zoning in order to make sure that they contribute to the right things. And the things that the issue here was the land use. We didn't say we want to control land use. We use a fancier word in the startup economy, which is we curate the land use. Instead of mixed use, you have a complex set of uses that you're trying to curate. So, I mean, and it started off as a little bit gimmicky, but I think that in the end, it turned out that the kinds of things that we needed to get in the innovation district for that kind of ecosystem are actually things that good cities need, which is affordable housing, right? A vibrant environment where people who are doing business, but also part of the community can exchange ideas. And so the things that, and then there was so we had what we called innovation housing, which was our version of micro housing. And the reason why we called it innovation housing and not micro housing was because we didn't want to define it as a size thing. So we were open to, in fact, the way that we tailored that piece of zoning with the developers said, well, we didn't define innovation housing. We used it in the document, and we basically said that the developer would have to come to present to us innovative ideas in housing, and that we, the planning agency, would decide whether it would qualify. So in addition to the 15% or the 13% inclusionary affordable housing, there was a requirement for 15 additional % of this innovation housing. And then we did a 20% requirement for what we call innovation, non-residential innovation uses, which the way I was quoted in the paper saying, a crate and barrel won't count because we already have them, but believe it or not, in Boston, there's no CB2. There still isn't, right? But if the developer provides a CB2, then it will count. If you have a Marriott, it doesn't count. But if you're piloting a new kind of use that we don't see, it will count. So the notion is that it would also cover the mom and pops, which are locally based sort of uses and businesses that we could promote.
Kairos, I'm going to have to cut you off in the interest of time, and I want to we have lots of good questions here that we didn't get to. A number of us will be at the reception, so feel free to come up and ask the questions. We've been pushing the limits of where zoning is going to today, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's resiliency, innovation districts. We're down to our last 5 minutes, so a minute each for each of you. Look out 10 years, or if you want 20 years, and what is the issue that we're going to have to address with a toolkit that includes zoning? And I'll start with you, Richard.
Well, I like to see more flexible housing opportunities that don't require 3 to 5 years of public review. We had Mayor Bloomberg's micro units, but we don't have a follow-up policy for that. So to have a special permit that would allow us to have that type of flexibility, but not go through a 3-year special permit process would be useful. So that type of nimble response for housing, I'm not sure how we do that in ULURP, but that's what I'd like to see.
Jerold.
So it's the issue that I think we should address, whether we have to is another question, is to go back to the good old days of the arranged marriage between zoning, land use planning, and capital infrastructure planning. The idea that these three things are divided out and in silos is absolutely preposterous, and zoning can't take all of the pressure. I mean, it had its 100th year, it's happy birthday, we love it, but enough already with zoning. Let's move on and really, do the sort of things that we need to do with all of these things together.
Kairos.
I think it's administering, how we administer any kind of regulation, and zoning in particular. I think that there's no way that codes are going to get smaller. They're going to get more and more complex. There will be 10,000 pages. But we also will have new ways of administering it, because I think there will be algorithms that will allow for the kind of, let's say, objective component of the measuring against zoning to take care of that and really leave enough flexibility for discretion where discretion is truly needed.
It now comes down to you, Harriet, the last word.
I really think that the issue of automobile utilization and the difference that autonomous vehicles are going to make means that a lot of space that we currently use for parking could be something else. So I think the zoning code in the very near future is going to have to encourage people to reuse their parking in innovative and beneficial to the city ways. Because for a lot of people, that parking, since it's not the primary use, it just kind of sits there in some residential and commercial buildings. Like in DC, it's hard to even know how much there is, but it's also the public spaces that we give over to automobile storage that could be repurposed. So I think zoning will have zoning and other regulation will have a role there, but the most important thing in every city is going to be to try to bias these autonomous vehicles to be shared and not individually owned. Because otherwise, if you think traffic is bad now, wait until electric vehicles that only cost a couple pennies to run an hour decide to circle and never park. And then see how you'll like your cities.
I wish that we could put this into a time capsule so that on the 200th anniversary, we could check to see how we're doing against it. Please join me in thanking these amazing panelists. And if I understand correctly, the reception is upstairs in the entry rotunda. See you there. It really did. This was fascinating. Thank you.